Welcome to EPA's webinar series on the new Environment Protection Laws. My name is Miranda Tolmer and I'm the Manager of the Industry Guidance Unit at EPA Victoria. And with me today is Con Lawless, the Director of Development and Infrastructure. Hi, Con.
It's good to see you in person.
Absolutely. And we're really pleased that you have joined us today to talk about the role of industry and business in protecting the environment. And as I said, this is part of our series that EPA is developing, a series of webinars on the new Environment Protection Laws which come into effect on 1 July this year. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands I am currently living and working, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And given that we're all in different locations today, I want to acknowledge the various traditional lands on which we are all meeting today. So you will note that our speakers are not wearing face masks today, and that is to ensure any participants who need to lip read can do so. And also, if you need or want to use closed captions, that function is available. Just look for the CC button at the bottom of this web screen. So today, Con and I are going to give you a brief introduction to the new laws, and then we're going to have a discussion with EPA's Director of Regional Operations, Marlene Mathias, and Director of Regulatory Programs, Dan Hunt. So they'll be joining us in a moment. And today we're really going to talk about the general environmental duty and assessing and controlling your risks. And we're going to move into, after that discussion, we'll move into some question and answers from you. So we encourage you to submit your questions in writing via the Slido function, which is to the right of your video box there. And I do encourage you to ask questions relating to the general environmental duty and assessing and controlling your risks, as the panel that we've assembled for you today are best placed to answer those. We will be reviewing and responding to the common themes from all of the questions that you do ask, though. Waste is always a very popular topic, and EPA has got a waste webinar coming up on June the 8th. So we will be forwarding through any questions that we receive specifically on waste to the team putting that webinar together, and they will make sure that they cover that content in that forum there. And I also want to note that today we won't be responding to any current issues or individual matters. So this session is recorded, and so it will be available to all people who registered on Eventbrite and sent out later. One more note is that this information that is presented today is provided as general guidance only, so it does not constitute legal or professional advice, and it should not be relied on as a replacement for consulting the laws directly to understand how they may apply to you. So we have had an excellent response to this event. Over 1,700 people have registered, and we've had about 60 pre-submitted questions already. So the themes from some of those pre-submitted questions we have discussed as a panel, and we've created some discussion points around those that our presenters will respond to during the question. But firstly, I'm going to ask Con to just give us a brief summary of the new laws. Thank you, Con.
Thanks so much, Miranda. So these are the biggest changes in 50 years, and it all happens on the 1st of July, Miranda, so we're literally 5 weeks away. And the first thing that these laws will do is to repeal the Environment Protection Act 1970, which many of us are going to celebrate. You need to understand what these laws are attempting to do, and that is to create a set of duties. And those duties require all of you to minimise the risks of harm to human health and the environment from pollution and waste. It sounds complicated, but in fact it's not, because what it's about is taking practical and reasonable steps and having in place really good environmental practices. So those of you that already have in place ways to manage your environmental risks are really ahead of the game, and these laws should provide you with no surprises, and in fact what they will allow you to do, as my colleagues Marlene and Dan will explain, is to in fact systematise what you've been doing for so long. Importantly, these laws are based on the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which I know all of you are familiar with. So the way in which these laws have been developed has really paid careful attention to the Health and Safety Act. So those of you who are familiar with managing the risks to your employees won't be taken at all by surprise by these laws. And I just want to really introduce the concept of the general environmental duty, and I know all of you have been paying attention to our previous webinars and seminars and been reading the extensive volume of material on our website. And I want to encourage you to keep doing that. But the general environmental duty is at the heart of this, and my colleagues Dan and Marlene will really tease that out for you. But for industry, the thing that I'd really want you to take away is that this is about a system of flexibility. Thank you.
And I did want to add to that, Con, as well. So in addition to the general duty, which is our focus for today, there are a series of other duties as well that you need to be aware of. And as Con mentioned, there's a lot of information on our website, but you do have requirements to manage your waste and contaminated land. You need to respond to pollution incidents if they occur, and you may need to seek permission depending on the activity that you undertake as well. So we aren't discussing those today, but there are a lot of resources to help you with that. And our website, we keep calling back to that, is a key source for that. Also, future webinars that are coming up. As I mentioned, the waste webinar on the 8th of June. And we do have a series of previous webinars as well with information there. Some other sources of information could be your industry association as well. We have been working with a number of industry associations over the last couple of years, and they can provide you with some good tailored information for your industry as well. So I'd now like to introduce the rest of our panel members. So Marlene Mathias, who's the Director of Regional Operations, and Dan Hunt, the Director of Regulatory Programs. And we're going to ask some questions about taking a risk-based approach, the general environmental duty, and what that means for you. So Marlene, I'm going to ask the first question of you. It's a pretty simple one, but it really is, what are environmental risks? And are we talking about being energy efficient or about making sure the things that you do don't actually harm people and the environment?
Good question. Thanks, Miranda. So if you think about what the remit of EPA and what we do every day, we're here to protect the environment from the harmful effects of pollution and waste. So we're not talking about energy efficient light globes or your carbon footprint, that's for other people. So thinking about that, some of the common risks you might find in your workplace are activities that generate noise, odour, emissions, any runoff that might come off from stormwater from your site, the management and disposal of waste, and use and storage of chemicals and where they might be stored. So that's some key risks on your site, and what we're asking people to do is know your risks and put some simple mitigations in place.
Terrific. Thank you.
Hey Dan, it's good to see you after all this time. So Dan, I want to know more about the general environmental duty. So as I understand it, it's about knowing your risks, putting controls in place, and making sure that you monitor and manage those risks. Can you just let us know how that's different to what is currently required under the EP Act? And also just give us a bit of the benefit of your really deep experience about how businesses can go about in understanding their risks.
Yeah, sure, Con. Currently EPA will respond to harm. We'll conduct licence compliance inspections of licensed premises under current legislation, but essentially under the GED, we'll be going out and looking at preventative measures that industry or companies or individuals have put in place. So what's that look like in a practical sense? Well, we would be expecting a company or an individual in their business to be going out where the work happens, walking around their business, understanding the hazards that may present, looking at source, what is the potential sources that may cause environmental harm, or harm to human health. What's the pathway by which that might enter a stormwater system, for example, or if it's odour, what's the pathway for that to get out into community, for example. And then finally, what's that receptor? So in this case of stormwater, that would be a local creek, etc. So then once you understand your risks and your hazards, you can then take a step back and think about practical controls you can put in place to manage those risks. EPA has a wealth of guidance to support local business and larger industry that's available on our EPA website. And it doesn't need to be that complicated, Con. I think there's really practical examples of things that are well known within industry sectors around how to manage some of these risks, but we just expect those controls to be in place.
Yeah. So, Dan, if I'm a small business and I employ 2 or 3 people, what are the kinds of things that I should be doing?
Great question, Con. So very simple things like bunding. So, you may not need to go and put in a large bunded area for storage of chemicals. You may only have a small amount of chemicals, in 2, 3 litre, 5 litre drums. There, in that application, a pallet bund would be a practical solution to prevent any discharge occurring from that. Controlling noise, making sure you keep your roller doors down. Training your staff on these things, and keeping records that you have actually trained them in how to be aware of their obligations under the GED.
Yes, so it's about taking those practical steps, isn't it?
That's right,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay, thank you.
One of the other things I wanted to ask as well was we talk about checking your controls at the end, so that regular review, that they are actually having the effect that they were intended when you implemented those. So I'm assuming that should be part of the process that you'd be looking for as well.
Absolutely, Miranda. Maintenance, think about, your vehicle. It needs to be regularly maintained to make sure it's working properly. It doesn't break down on you when you actually need it. Same rule applies under the general environmental duty. You must maintain your equipment. You must check that it's working. And most importantly, if an Environment Protection Officer comes to your business, they will be expecting to be able to see records that you have done that.
Excellent, thank you. So those concepts do sound quite simple, but the general environmental duty also talks about eliminating or minimising the risk of harm so far as reasonably practicable. So I'd like to have a bit of a conversation about what that means. What is reasonably practicable? Marlene, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, so it's an interesting concept. So I think it's really about what's something proportionate to manage the risk. So for high order risks, and when we're looking at our current licensed sites, we would expect some extensive understanding of risks and mitigations of those. But for a small business, we're looking, so I think Dan said it really well earlier, you don't need to have, you need to have bunding, but what type of bunding you need to manage your chemical runoff is a pallet bunding's fine for a small volume. So there's probably some other things that we could talk about in terms of examples, but it's really what's the risk, what's the size of the business, and what's something proportionate to manage that risk. I don't know if there's any other examples, Dan.
It's all about the scale of your business, the activities that you conduct. So essentially, I think you've answered that question, Marlene. It's about what's proportionate for the size of business, how much chemical you may store on any given site, how many truck movements you may have at any particular site. All of that comes into play around reasonably practical.
Yeah, so I guess, Marlene and Dan, it starts with identifying your risks. Once you understand those risks, you can then determine which controls to put in place. But I think from hearing the message, unless you identify them at first instance, you're really behind the ball, aren't you? Yeah.
That's right.
So EPA has also developed some guidance on what is reasonably practicable, and that is available on our website as well. And that talks through some of the criteria that you can consider for your business operation, so that you can determine for your particular set of circumstances what would be reasonably practicable in that situation. Thanks. So this is related, and sometimes it can be a bit difficult to know exactly how to eliminate or minimise environmental risks. So I'd like some advice from you, Dan. I'll start with you. For business who are really trying to determine what controls might be best for their particular situation, there's a lot of information out there, and how would you advise a business to sort of to start that process?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Miranda. So essentially there's no one way to control a risk. There's always multiple options. It leads back to the scale of business, as I said before. So EPA would expect if you have a high volume of operations or particular tasks in that operations and that presents a greater risk, you need to have increased controls to manage that risk. So what I would advise people to do is go to trusted sources. Go to EPA's website. There's really practical, easy to understand guidance on things like stormwater controls. Go to industry associations. You know, they always have a wealth of knowledge in this space. You know, and if you're really, really stuck and you're looking at a very technical, complex piece of plant or equipment that you need to control, I would recommend, you know, you can always engage professional services like environmental consultants to help you through that. So it's all about, you know, the fact that we understand, you know, people in industry know their business, they know it really well, and they are able to look at things practically and control the risk. I'd also add to that saying, again, coming back to source pathway receptor, it's always preferable to control the risk upstream at the source. That should always be the starting point, and if it's unable to be controlled at that point, you then move down to other ends of the scale. Pathway, for example, you may decide to put in a stormwater valve so you can shut off stormwater to your facility. But if we go upstream of that to the source, it may be simpler to put in bunding of chemicals, training of staff, etc.
Or potentially even using a different input at the start that has potentially less environmental impact in the first place.
Absolutely,
Eliminate it
Miranda.
altogether.
Correct.
Excellent. Did anyone want to add anything more to that?
No, I think Dan summarised it well, and I just want to emphasise the point that Dan made, that looking at the risk at its source is absolutely vital in understanding how to best comply with these laws. So we would encourage everyone out there listening today to make that something really important in your EMS systems. Look at the pathway. Look at the source, I should say.
Excellent, thanks. So we have talked a little bit about what you can do as business on the ground. So now I want to ask Marlene, what will our environment protection officers be looking for when they go onto sites or visiting a business? How will they know if a business has taken those steps that we've just been discussing?
Great question again. So, look, for people that haven't seen our Environment Protection Officers before, the first thing they'll be doing is asking a lot of questions. So expect that they'll be asking, what's that piece of equipment, what does that do? Then officers will be asking about looking for things like a risk register, talking to staff, asking staff about what do they know about what they need to be doing. There's lots of things that we'll be asking for. So we reasonably expect businesses to know what's going on, to have trained their staff, to understand the risks and have practical things in place to mitigate those risks. And I think, so we've spoken quite a bit back and forth about the general environmental duty. Those are the sort of key pillars of the general environmental duty. That's what we'll be looking for. So sometimes we'll be there because we'll have had a pollution report in, but we'll still be looking at what did you have in place to stop that happening.
Yeah, okay. So keep going up the stream to that prevention all the time.
That's right.
Thank you.
So Dan, just thinking about what Marlene has just told us, under the new laws, what might happen if a business hasn't tried to understand their risks or put in place inadequate control? So take us through how the EPA is going to be thinking about this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Con. So essentially, we'll be taking a proportionate approach. So essentially, there's a lot of factors that we'll take into account when we come onto site around what specific statutory tools under our laws we'll be applying in any given circumstance. So if I take sanctioning for an example, we've got the ability to issue official warnings, infringement notices, or more serious prosecution. But it's all about being proportionate. So we'll assess any matter on a case-by-case basis, we'll look at, was the act intentional? What level of controls did you have in place, and how well did you try and prevent the harm from occurring? Did you even have any controls at all? Will also come into it. So, and then ultimately, was there harm, and did harm result, and how serious was the harm? So that's a little bit on sanctioning. In relation to our other approaches, we've got a range of tools that we can use. An improvement notice is probably the one that people will see most commonly. That's essentially replacing what we currently have under our current legislation as a pollution abatement notice. So essentially, this is a notice that we'll use when we conduct our site investigations and audits of your facilities. We will be looking for areas that you haven't got controls in place, and then issue you with an improvement notice to make sure that you go and implement that control. Now, it's important to note that failure to comply with a statutory notice is a really serious issue, and it is something that EPA will be treating very seriously. Essentially, it's a requirement under law that you comply with that notice, and failure to comply with that will be treated appropriately and proportionately under a sanction.
And Dan, we're going to be transparent, so we will publish a compliance enforcement policy, a sanctions policy, and some other policies, so that everyone out there will get a sense of what EPA will think about issues, so that we can act consistently and hopefully predictably. That's right, isn't it? Because we don't want to. We're not after gotcha moments, are we? We don't want to take people by surprise. Compliance is an important thing. So for us, being transparent is pretty important, I imagine.
Absolutely, Con. Yeah, it's important that people know what they can expect from EPA on any given issue. As you said, the compliance and enforcement policy is really our guiding star when we look at what type of approach are we going to take to a particular situation with regard to serving of notices or issuing of infringements or prosecutions and the like. So absolutely it is. I think the other tools that we have available to us is a raft of notices. So we have environmental action notices, so we will use those in circumstance where we need an individual or a company to undertake clean-up of a site. Prohibition notices is another one, so that's where we'll use those again proportionately, but they require immediate ceasing of any activities on site, but we'll use those sparingly. They're for all more extreme circumstances.
So Dan, you've told us about a few things. Let's just tell the audience a little bit about a little more of them. So first of all, let's start with environmental action notices. Are they new under these new laws?
They are, but essentially they're quite similar to our current clean-up notices that we use. So the powers are quite similar, but they are a new tool in that they are now an environmental action notice, and we can. But essentially the outcome is the same. They require clean-up. But there are other new tools that we have available to us, Con. So.
Let's talk about prohibition notices, because I imagine people who might have heard that for the first time are going to be a little bit concerned about what the word prohibition might entail. So can you just let us know a bit more about how those notices work, and perhaps even the circumstances in which EPA might use them?
Sure. Let's take a fire hazard as a real-world example. So an environmental officer will turn up to a site. They may see a smouldering waste pile at the facility. There's a real risk of real hazard occurring. The officer can form a reasonable belief that there's likely to be a fire. The fire may spread. It's likely to impact local community and cause a real hazard. So in that circumstance, we can issue a prohibition notice to require the duty holder to cease all activity on that site related to that waste pile. We can require them then through directions and other means to separate waste out, and obviously would work with emergency services in that scenario. But I'm taking a really high-level, really hazardous situation, I guess, to try and get across when we would use those sorts of powers.
So I guess, Dan, in EPA's mind, it's the hazard and also the immediacy of the risk that would trigger the prohibition.
Absolutely, Con. Yeah, that's 100%. Yeah,
okay.
Summarised very well.
Potluck. And so, Dan, me again, and I don't mean to pick on you, but just tell us a little bit more about some of the other regulatory tools. So we've covered the prohibition notice. Can you just let us know a little bit more about improvement notices, which you mentioned a couple of questions ago?
Yeah, sure. The easiest way I draw an analogy on the improvement notice is to think about the OH&S legislation.
Yep.
So essentially, OH&S legislation doesn't wait for someone to get their hand caught in a machine or their hair caught in a machine. It's about taking that preventative approach to put a guard on the machine before someone injures themselves. Our general environmental duty is very similar. And the improvement notice that others in the OH&S regulation would also use. So it's requiring that you go and put a guard on that machine. We would go out, we would observe and say, well, there's no guard on that machine, you need to put it on. It would be the same for environmental controls. Okay, so there's no bunding, you've got liquid waste stored right next to a storm water drain. There are no controls present to prevent that discharge if there was a leak or a puncture of the container. And therefore, here's an improvement notice for you to go and do that thing. Improvement, most importantly, our notices are not sanctions. They are statutory instruments that direct you to do a particular thing, which will ultimately be monitoring, clean-up, undertaking an investigation, ceasing activities, or implementing controls. So they're a direction to do something. They're not a punitive measure.
So I guess, Dan, EPA is going to be issuing, of all of its notices, and improvement notices, probably going to be the most commonly issued.
Absolutely.
And I guess also it's a way that EPA will bring a person into compliance with the general environmental duty. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely, Con. Yeah, it's all. You can take an improvement notice as I am requesting you to do a particular thing that I feel is reasonably practicable, and I have formed a reasonable view that that is a practical solution to an area where I see you haven't controlled your risk appropriately.
Thank you. You're not out of this yet. I've got two more that I wouldn't mind asking you about. Dan, can you just let us know about notices, a notice to investigate, how it works and how it may be used in the future?
Yeah, sure. So Notice Investigate is basically a tool that we will use where there's a reasonable belief. You're hearing I'm using that term quite a lot. There's a reasonable belief that there's potential contamination at a site through the soil. So if we form that view, we will issue you with a notice to investigate, and that will require you to go and undertake some testing to prove or disprove that there is contamination or there's not contamination at the site. What that will likely then follow with is an environmental action notice then, if it is contaminated, to potentially go and clean up that contamination.
Last one. I promise it's the last one. Dan, I read with interest there's something called a site management order.
There is.
You have to tell us about that.
Yeah, site management order is a brand new tool under the legislation. So essentially, we understand that sometimes there's only so far you can go in cleaning up a premises that's been contaminated. There'll be pollution of groundwater, there's pollution of soil. How far is reasonably practicable to go and clean up that material to make it safe? So there's always circumstances where remediation of soil and groundwater will take you to a certain point. Some contamination therefore then remains, and what EPA then uses a site management order to do is to ensure that there's adequate monitoring of that contamination that's remaining. We then get reporting in from a company or an individual on that contamination at a specified frequency, and we're able to then monitor that remaining contamination to make sure that it's not posing a risk to human harm, human health, or the environment.
I guess, Dan, it's therefore about long-term management measures in
Absolutely.
place. So if there's a difference between environmental action notices and site management orders, the site management order is really focused on the longer term, and it might be years, it might be decades, depending on the issues.
Yeah, 100% correct, Con. It's also a useful tool as it's actually attached to the title of the property as well. So anyone that's purchasing land will be able to see on the title that a potential site has a site management order and there is ongoing contamination that needs to be monitored.
Thank you. I think that's the interrogation over, Miranda.
Look, no, that was actually a terrific discussion. There's lots of language there around around different tools and those sorts of things that are available to our officers to use in appropriate circumstances. But I'm going to come back now to a question I previously asked Marlene just before about what that looks like on the ground when we have an authorised officer visiting a site and they're making these sorts of assessments. How would they be having these conversations with the business owner? Will they be looking to support them, providing them with some information that we have, and how much is back on the operator to make these sorts of decisions for their business?
So really, in terms of on the ground, and what we spoke about earlier, is that the improvement notice will be the key notice. There is another tool. So compliance advice is another formal statutory tool we have under the new legislation, so we'll be capturing that. So when our officers are out, we'll be having those discussions, we'll be asking lots of questions. When they identify something that needs to be managed or isn't being managed appropriately or reasonably practicably, there's sort of two routes, and people will be talking directly to business owners saying, this needs some improvement. There's compliance advice that can be provided and captured, and it'll be formally captured, or we'd issue an improvement notice that says you need to manage this risk. There will be options in how you do that, and we would expect that the business owner looks to that guidance that's out there to put something in place. So that's what it'll look like. It'll be a conversation then captured in a formal document that will be emailed or posted through.
Excellent, thank you.
And again, I think, Marlene, it goes to the proportionate approach. So how big is the risk we're dealing with? Is it more relevant to give compliance advice to tweak the hazard control that's in place, or does it actually present quite a serious risk of harm, and therefore then is a improvement notice a more applicable way to go?
Yeah. Although I think on an improvement notice, it's still a way for us to help duty holders know what they need to do. So it's really still helpful advice. It will be proportionate, but it's a way of EPA saying this needs to be managed. Did you know that? And it's providing some advice on that front.
Yeah.
And Marlene, each time one of our officers attends a site, they need to leave a formal record behind. It's called an entry report. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
So that's some of the formal documentation. Yeah. So if there was an improvement notice, we'd issue an entry report that says generally what we saw, as well as an improvement notice. So you'll get two formal documents.
Yeah, and so if our officer gives compliance advice, the compliance advice is going to be recorded in the report.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So at the end of our discussion panel there, I just wanted to come back to you both and just ask for your one key takeaway message before we move into some of the specific questions from our audience today. So Marlene, I'll start with you.
Oh, so many things. I think, look, a good wrap up of everything we've talked about is that from the 1st of July, our officers will be out there looking from a preventative mindset. So we'll be asking questions, we'll be looking that there's preventative measures in place, that you know your risks. So if there's nothing else that you've taken away from this morning, it's know your environmental risks, look at your site, know your environmental risks, and start thinking about what you need to put in place to manage those.
Thanks. Dan?
Quite similar to Marlene. It's all about getting out into your business, understanding the risks that are present. What are those hazards? How are you going to control them? And really taking a step back to think through what may occur and what's the likelihood of that occurring. And then taking action. Implementing simple controls to make sure that when an officer does come out to site, you can easily demonstrate to that officer that you have controls in place that are proportionate to the risks of your operation, and that you're ultimately preventing any harm to the environment or human health.
Excellent. Thank you both very much for those wrap-ups. So before we move into the live Q&A session or answering your specific questions. There's a couple of pre-submitted questions that I'm going to put to our panel. So continue to type your questions into the Slido bar to the right of your screen. And I'm going to just pick a couple out of the pre-submitted questions already. So the first one is actually from the agriculture sector, but I think the question actually applies quite broadly, and that is what processes will be in place for education, and in this question is for the farming community on the ground, and how does EPA plan to drive adherence to the new standards?
So it's a great question. I think it's got many parts to it. So if we focus on sort of what's available now in terms of guidance, so our EPA website that we've spoken about a few times this morning has some really great sector-based guidance, as well as guidance on knowing and managing your risks. So that's a really great resource. I think there's also some programs out there. So there's the Industry Partnership Program. So EPA is working with industry guidance groups, supporting some training and some upskilling. On the ground, obviously our Environment Protection Officers will be out there. So we'll be providing practical guidance to support and education when we're out and about. There is also some, particularly out in the regional areas, we're running face-to-face sessions in terms of drop-in sessions that have been advertised on the website and Twitter in terms of coming in and speaking to people about your particular questions. So there's lots of avenues to be able to seek some guidance and ask some questions if you're concerned.
Thank you. And the next one was submitted by an audience member who works in manufacturing. It was about, is monitoring mandatory if you don't hold an EPA licence? Dan, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. So essentially, monitoring isn't always essential, but it's good practice. So if we're talking about emissions to air, yes, absolutely, you should be monitoring. Why should you monitor? Because when an Environment Protection Officer comes around to your premises, even if you're unlicensed, they will very much want to know how can you show me that the hazard has been controlled and you are actually not emitting anything to air. You know, again, links back to the maintenance question, you know, around, well, you also then need to maintain your equipment. So, you know, if you're working at a panel beater, for example, you need to have controls off your spray booths to make sure there's no paint emissions to air. Making sure that you maintain those controls is equally important, and you need to keep good record keeping of that as well.
Yep, thank you. And another pre-submitted question was, please describe the likely or expected interaction between an accredited environmental management system, so an EMS, and the general environmental duty. Marlene, would you like to have a go at that one?
So if we come back to the general environmental duty, so it's know your risks and put some controls in place. So an EMS, so an environmental management system, is a really great framework for working through that. If you have an EMS or you're thinking about putting an EMS in place, then it gives you a really great framework to look at your risks, look at your environmental risks, look at those controls. It's not mandatory that you need an EMS, but when our officers are out on the ground and you're able to present your accredited environmental management system, it'll go a long way to answering the questions we have and showing that you're meeting the general environmental duty.
But Marlene, if I'm a small business and I hire I've got a staff of 3, would I need to have an EMS?
I don't think so, because then it comes back to the reasonably practicable question, which is If you've got 3 staff and yourself, then you probably need some written procedures, but you don't need a formal EMS.
But you would expect me to know what my risks were and,
That's right.
and to have a look at them and to think about which controls were in place. So even if I don't have a formal system because I just can't afford it, you would expect me to still have something in play so I can demonstrate to one of your officers that I'm taking the law seriously and I know my risks.
That's right. And as long as you can talk us through that
Gotcha.
and make sure that your staff are trained in terms of what those controls are, then that meets the requirements.
I will add to that as well, there is a very simple risk register template in our assessing and controlling risk guidance that is available on EPA's website as well. So if you need there's some very simple tools that are available for that situation as well. All right, I think we are ready to move into the live Q&A. So I'm going to ask the first question there, and that is, I am going to ask, what's the process for sites that are already established and did not need an operating licence in the past but require one under the new legislation? When will EPA be releasing guidance on this? Marlene, are you able to answer this one? Yeah.
I can take that one.
Lovely.
So firstly, the guidance on the process will be available on the EPA website in June. So that's next month. A couple of other things that are really important to note. The regulations as they've been made provide a 3-month period after commencement of the legislation. So 3 months after the 1st of July to make an application. So if you find yourself in the situation where you need a licence from the 1st of July, you have 3 months to apply for that. So you've got until the 1st of October 2021 to apply.
Excellent. Thank you. And Dan, I'm going to ask you a question that's come through about how the new laws interact with OH&S legislation. And maybe Dan and Con, you probably both would like to comment on this one.
Yeah, sure. So both pieces of legislation have a requirement to protect human health. So how do they interact? So, for example, I think the question was sort of, well, is it EPA looks outside the property boundary and WorkSafe works within the property boundary at the workplace? That's not true. So essentially both WorkSafe and ourselves have responsibility to protect human health within the property boundary, and we also then will go outside the property boundary to local community, etc. So it really depends on the circumstance. So the way I could simplify it the most is to say EPA looks at the environmental impacts upon human health. And there might be times where WorkSafe and ourselves will overlap, but we work very well with our co-regulators and we have memorandums of understanding of how we do that. So absolutely we'll be joined at the hip where those overlaps do occur.
Yeah. And Dan, it's fair to say that the overlaps occur now under the existing laws, and EPA has a really good history of working together with WorkSafe and their inspectors. And you've mentioned the MOUs, and I also know that EPA has done sort of joint regulatory task forces with WorkSafe. So we would just understand that things will just continue to work well.
Yeah, completely agree, Con. Yeah, we work with WorkSafe and other co-regulators quite regularly. It's part of business as usual for us.
Thanks, Dan.
Now, I can see there's a couple of questions coming through about things like declaration of use and some other contaminated land guidance. I'm going to forward those questions on particularly waste and those sorts of things to the next webinar. So June 8, sign into that one, and there will be a panel of waste experts pulled together to answer your waste questions. We, as I've said earlier in this presentation as well, we will be responding to the general themes that come through this as well. So we will certainly answer those questions, but I'm going to try and focus on the general environmental duty and assessing your risk questions today. There is one I will address though, because I because I can. There's a lot of questions relating to asking about the duty to notify of contaminated land and the duty to manage contaminated land. And EPA will be releasing guidance on both of those duties prior to 1 July. That guidance will be published on the website, and that will support people understand the nature of those duties. Okay, the next question I'm going to ask is about, will EPA make it clear to community what EPA's priorities are? So, yes, they've very kindly noted here that our staff obviously can't attend every noise, odour or water report, and especially with a number of new sites being permissioned. And the questioner here has noted that fire prevention is a priority, and that is absolutely correct. So how do we manage that out in the field? Dan, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. As any regulator does, we prioritise our effort to areas where there's high risk. We're intelligence-led around what we are seeing out in industry, what community are telling us, what industry is telling us around potential non-compliant behaviours, and we will then work with our strategy team to develop up strategies that we can then understand what the risks are, what the outcome is that we're seeking, how we get behaviour change within certain individuals that may be conducting illegal activities or through some ignorance having an effect on the environment. And we essentially then target our compliance focus to those efforts. Fire prevention is a classic example of that. Number of fires in the landscape, particularly earlier this year. EPA then decided, right, this is a real problem. We've worked with our co-regulatory partners and emergency services, and we're out there implementing that right now to make sure that industry has proper separation of waste, and they're managing their risks, and they're putting in controls to prevent fires from occurring.
Marlene, do you want to add to that about how we prioritise what we attend in terms of sending officers out into the field?
Yes.
Or has Dan covered it? Because that would also be okay.
No, so I think largely it's been covered. So it's about risk-based, but we have established processes to look at, particularly when pollution reports come in, what's an immediate response that we need to go out to, what's something that might take us a little bit of time. So we seek to look at themes and risks and deploy our staff based on the highest environmental risk. Whatever we do, whether it's work that we planned or work that's responsive from pollution reports.
Okay, terrific. Thank you both. The next question is a question here about training material. So is there material that EPA can provide around the general environmental duty for us to be able to roll out to our operational personnel? I'm going to take this one, seeing as that's my wheelhouse. So yes, there is. There's a lot of information, as we've said quite a bit today, but on the website. There's also some overarching sector guides, which provide an overview of the new laws and the duties, but tailored to specific sectors. They're available on the website as well. And we do have an industry partnership program that we will be supporting industry associations to roll out training to their members. So we will make those training materials available in the near future, but in the interim we recommend you to visit the industry landing page on our website. I'm going to go to the next question around what does the GED do? So, Con, I'm going to ask you to answer this one. What does the General Environmental Duty do that the Environment Protection Act 1970 didn't do, in terms of the question sort of finishes there? Oh no, responsibility for avoiding or reducing the risk of pollution.
Look, it does a lot, but the thing that I want to say that to contrast the old Act with the new Act is that under the old Act, EPA had to wait for harm to take place. In other words, the pollution to occur. Under the new Act, Marlene and Dan have made this point continually, it's all about the risk. So EPA will be looking at risks, and EPA can intervene at the point in which the risk is uncontrolled, so that it's no longer waiting for pollution to happen. It's more about looking at the risks, Miranda, that are uncontrolled and intervening at that point in time. So it's an exciting development. And it does, as we mentioned at the start, it does bring these laws into line with the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Fabulous, thank you. I'm going to go to one here for Dan around, can you explain what we mean by risk? What does proportionate mean for different kinds of risks? So if there's a low probability but a very high consequence risk versus a high probability but a low consequence. Can you elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think they've answered their own question there. I mean, risk management is all about likelihood and consequence of harm. So absolutely, that is what we mean by risk. To elaborate on that a little further, though, the general environmental duty, talks about a state of knowledge. What's the state of knowledge within a particular sector around how to best control certain risks or hazards that may be present. The benefit to that is, we used to talk a lot about best practice, and best practice, as we know, continually evolves. There's new technologies, there's new systems, new processes that continually evolve, and what the general environmental duty does around the state of knowledge is allows industry to move with that state of knowledge rather than saying, best practice, 2021 looks like this, and then years later you then have to say again, well, the best practice now looks like this. We just say, well, the state of knowledge is what the best practice is, and that is what we would expect. But again, very much depends on the scale, the size of your operations, around what EPA would practically expect you to be installing to control risk. Yep. It leads back to Marlene's earlier point around, what's reasonably practicable. Yep.
You mentioned the term state of knowledge there, and there is actually a question that has come in about state of knowledge, so that was very timely. So I'm going to address that briefly because there is a bit of a definition around that, and it really, state of knowledge describes that body of accepted knowledge that is known or ought reasonably known, and I think that's a key point in that, is that ignorance is no defence. If your peers in your sector know that sort of information, you would be expected to as well. And that knowledge pertains to the risks of the nature of your operations, but also the sorts of controls that are available to eliminate or reduce those risks for those situations. So state of knowledge encompasses lots of pieces of information, if you like. So it does include, of course, EPA guidance that we publish, also things like Australian industry standards, and scientific engineering research papers, and also like information from your industry associations, and of course any notices or information that EPA has provided in a formal manner to you during a site visit. So that's a bit of a definition of that term, state of knowledge, for you. Thanks. Now I am going to go to a question about improvement notices. So will EPA specify the nature of the controls to be implemented in an improvement notice, or will we just require a reasonably practicable control to be identified by the operator? Either of you two want to take a go at that one?
I'll take that one.
Lovely.
So I think it depends. So that's not a helpful answer, so I'll elaborate a little bit more. So it depends on the context. So there might need to be an assessment first. So an improvement notice might say do an assessment and then do something. In certain circumstances, we may be prescriptive. So it sort of depends on what an officer sees. It depends on the judgment. It depends on the conversation you have on site. So it will be a mix of the two. Generally, an outcome-based requirement is probably better for EPA and a business holder, because then there's some options. As Dan said earlier, there's lots of different ways to mitigate risk. It's not one size fits all for everybody everywhere. So where we can, we'll look to set out outcome-based requirements, but saying that it depends on the context.
So let's say, Marlene, I'm about to receive a notice, and in that discussion, I tell you about how I propose to control the risks, and your officer thinks it's a suitable way to do it. In some cases, will that be incorporated in the risk? Will I have the ability as a duty holder to have some influence over what's in the notice? Because I know my risks pretty well, so.
Again, I think it depends.
Okay.
So it would come down to judgment at the time. I think there's always a good discussion about timeframes and about what's being proposed. Sometimes, if it's a really good solution, possibly. If there's probably further discussion, or it might be a bit more open-ended.
And the key though is that bit about discussion. We expect and encourage duty holders to have a discussion with officers about what's going on and how to remedy the risk. It's not a setting really tight controls. It's about a discussion that leads to the best environmental outcome.
That's right.
Thanks.
And we may not always agree.
Absolutely.
And I think when that happens, environment protection officers will look at, well, what's the risk here? What's the consequence? Is it a practical solution? Is it in line with industry state of knowledge? Where is the closest receptor? What's the likelihood of the impact? And is the control being proposed actually really adequate? What's the history of the site will be another one. Have we got a lot of complaints around the area around odour or dust, for example? In those sorts of circumstances, if the officer doesn't agree with the site manager on what the appropriate control is, they may choose to specify exactly what they would like installed as a control for that issue.
Great.
And as I said earlier, it's about being proportionate.
Thank you.
So the next question actually leads on very nicely to that, and it's about have our officers had appropriate and extensive training to visit a site?
All of our officers. So we've got a sort of two cohorts. So there's currently authorised officers, so that includes myself. So we've all undergone retraining, if you like, so training to understand the new legislation, what are our expectations. But previous to that, we've all been trained and we have requirements in terms of safety courses and others to be able to visit a site. So absolutely, all of our current officers and all of our new officers will be reauthorised and assessed under the new legislation.
Thank you. There's a question here about permissions. Marlene, I think that you'll be able to answer this one. So it's the questioner has stated that it's currently difficult to understand which businesses or processes need a registration or a permit versus a licence, for example. And so they've asked who determines the level of risk around and the level of risk that is required. They've stated they're probably in a low risk, so registration, but it's a bit unclear about how to obtain that registration. Can you help and provide some clarity to that? Thank you.
So not dissimilar to the earlier question around licences, but particularly for registration and permits. So Schedule 1 of the Environment Protection Regulation sets out all the criteria for what needs a permit and registration. And in most cases, it's about your operating capacity. So what's your site's designed to be able to have as a throughput? So when you're talking about processing, it's not necessarily what you're processing now, it's about what the design limit of your site is. So there's guidance that's going to be released in terms of how and when to make an application for a permission, noting that the legislation goes live on the 1st of July, but there is a grace period. So for all tiers, so for licences, permits and registration, there will be a grace period. So you're not expected to apply now in anticipation of the 1st of July. So there's EPA's also developing a simple online tool to help you understand whether you need a permit or registration. So that should be on our website in the coming months.
And Marlene, in general terms though, the higher the risk of the activity, the more likely it is that you will need something. And if it's a high-risk activity, it's likely to be a licence and then cascading downwards towards registration. So I guess the message we want to give to the audience is that registrations are going to be used for, I guess, the lower level of risks.
That's right. So licences is for our highest tier of risk, then permits for that next level down, and then registrations as a kind of EPA knows you're there, but generally we expect you to be managing your risks.
I need to jump in there because the time has flown in responding to our audience questions, and I now need to wrap us up. So thank you very much, panel, Dan, Marlene and my co-host Con. So thank you very much for responding to those questions. So thank you very much for joining us. The recording and links will be available to everyone who registered for this event through Eventbrite. And as always, I think we could count the number of times we've said this, but please visit our website. There is a lot of information there on the new laws. There's also a lot of guidance there that will help explain these core concepts and the duties that are applicable to you. So I think we mentioned earlier, but if you are a small business, so you don't have huge teams of people to help you with your environmental responsibilities, there are simple tools and guidance available for you on the website as well. And I'm going to draw your attention to one in particular. There's a small business assessment tool, and there's also guidance around assessing and controlling risks. Some of those materials have been translated into other languages as well. There's also risk videos available on our website and our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to subscribe to our quarterly e-bulletins, and we have those for industry, community and local government. Please also follow us on our socials. So we have Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook. There's also our EPA phone number, so 1300 EPA, which is 1300 372 842, or our email, which is contact@epa.vic.gov.au. One more reminder that our Waste Framework Overview webinar will be held on Tuesday the 8th of June. There will be a registration link popped into the chat, so you can register for that through Eventbrite as well. And please forward that to your network so that they can attend the event as well. EPA will continue to support businesses understand and comply with these new laws. That is our commitment to you, but we do thank you very much for attending today and for your insightful questions. We hope you learned a little bit more about understanding risk and managing that in your operations, and about the general environmental duty. So I'd like to thank my panel again today, Con Lawless, Marlene Mathias and Dan Hunt, and thank you very much for joining us. Thanks.